for India Studies' first online web lecture in its 15-year history. We're extremely excited to have everyone here. My name is Nish Jayban. I'm a lawyer from Houston and a director of FIS. As a director of FIS, it's my privilege today to serve as the event chair and moderator for today's presentation. First of all, I want to thank everyone so much for joining us in these challenging and uncertain times. 2020 has been a turbulent year for all of us between the COVID-19 pandemic and most recently, the growing tensions between India and China. Given the recent conflict between these two countries, the future of Indo-Chinese relations is now more uncertain than ever. Today's lecture will examine the past, the present, and the future of the competition between these two world's largest countries by population, and should provide some clarity on what to expect in the coming years. Before we begin, I want to go over the structure of today's program. The lecture will be a 30-minute or so presentation, followed by an interactive Q&A with the community. If anyone has questions they want Dr. Xavier to answer, I want them to please type in the Q&A box at the bottom of their Zoom screen. When you do so, please enter your name and your location, and that way we can properly credit everyone who asks a question. Again, anyone who isn't a presenter is going to be muted, so it's really important that everyone type in their questions in a clear and concise manner, and that way we'll be able to make sure that Dr. Xavier can answer them as soon as they're sent. So before we formally kick off the presentation, I want to introduce FIS's founder and chairman, Krishna Vavilala. Krishna is, as I said, the founder and chairman at FIS, and he's founded the organization all the way back in 2005, about 15 years ago. Krishna is going to speak a few words about what FIS has been up to over those 15 years and kick off our presentation formally. So please join me in welcoming FIS founder and chairman, Krishna Vavilala.
Thank you, Nish, for the nice introduction. As the chairman of the Foundation for India Studies, I welcome you all for this webinar. We are a registered non-profit, non-political community organization established, as Nish said, 15 years ago. During these 15 years, we are proud to have initiated a number of projects in Houston, like the India Studies program at the University of Houston, Indo-American Oral History Project, and the distinguished lectures and town hall meetings. Last but not the least, our participation in the MLK parades over the past 9 years have brought the Indian community closer to the mainstream American grassroots. And we were also presented with a Grand Marshal Award in 2015, which you can see in my background. Indo-American History Project is also a signature project for us. It was designed to capture the life stories of the first generation Indian immigrants who came over from India in the 60s and 70s. We have so far interviewed 60 Indian immigrants, and their stories have been digitally archived in the Houston Metropolitan Research Center of the Houston Public Library. On August 15th, India celebrated its 74th Independence Day. Even though we left India decades ago, our minds and hearts are still with India. We strive to connect India with the American mainstream through educational programs to facilitate better understanding of Indian issues. The subject of today's webinar is very particularly in view of the recent incursions by China into India's northeastern borders, particularly in the Galwan Valley. We are thankful to Dr. Constantino Xavier from the Brookings Institute, a New Delhi-based think tank. He will explain in detail the India-China competition in South Asia.
Thank you so much, Krishna, for that recap of FIS's activities. Now, without further ado, I want to introduce Dr. Constantino Xavier, our distinguished speaker for today's lecture. Dr. Xavier is a fellow in foreign policy studies at the Brookings Institute in New Delhi and the Brookings Institute in Washington, D.C. He's an internationally renowned expert on India's foreign policy and security policies as a regional power and focuses on institutions and decision-making processes and Indo-European relations. In addition, Dr. Xavier's research covers India's crisis response and involvement in neighboring countries such as Nepal, Sri Lanka, Myanmar, Bhutan, and others. He also looks into connectivity and security across the South Asian and Indian Oceans regions, and looks into how India's democratic values and institutions influence its foreign relations. Before working at Brookings India in New Delhi, Dr. Xavier worked at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. as a media correspondent in South Asia and as an advisor to the Embassy of Portugal in New Delhi. Dr. Xavier comes from a rich pedagogical heritage. He has held fellowships at the Institutes for Defense Studies and Analyses and the Observer Research Foundation in New Delhi. In addition, he has received research awards from the United States Fulbright Program and the Indian Council for Cultural Relations. In addition to his vast experience, Dr. Xavier holds a PhD in South Asian Studies from the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. Background-wise, Dr. Xavier himself is a testament to India's interconnectivity. His father is from Goa and his mother is from Germany, and he grew up in Portugal. However, for the last several years, Dr. Xavier has lived and worked in New Delhi and is an active contributor to foreign policy there. So please join me in giving a warm virtual welcome to Dr. Constantino Xavier.
Thank you so much, Nish. Very generous and kind introduction. Do feel free to interrupt me if there's technical problems, if you don't hear me well, if there's anything, you are mandated to do so. Nish, with your permission, before I pull up my PowerPoint presentation and torture you for the next 25 minutes with some of my knowledge and insights and studies which are ongoing, I just really like to do three quick notes of thanks, I think, to you for really hosting this and the whole team of the Foundation for India Studies. You know, it's not usual for me to share some of my sort of quite expert technical work with a wider audience, generalist audience from different areas with different areas of expertise. But, you know, when Mr. Vavilala approached me, I immediately said yes. And I'd like to explain, I think, why I said so without any conditions immediately. I think the first reason is really, as you mentioned, I grew up as a part of India's wider diaspora too. And therefore, I think I really appreciate the importance of community organizations like the Foundation for India Studies. And the role of people like Nish, in particular of Mr. Vavilala, who's really led this institution, this Diaspora Community Association, to not just be a repetition of folklore, cultural celebrations, but also, like your name really indicates, an institution that studies India and is connected in furthering the knowledge about India. The second reason is really the importance of bridging the past and the present. I think you know, these diaspora organizations like yours play a very important role in that. I was really pleased to meet Dr. Colonel Bala, who's joining us here today in one of the test runs we had for this meeting. I mean, someone who joined the Indian Army in the 1950s, right? And this is someone we can learn so much from, especially for us, the younger generation, Nish, you and me, I think many of your colleagues and other in this team. I think it's really a pleasure to be part of networks and communities like these that transfer knowledge from the older generations that know a different India to the younger generations who are really crafting a new India. And finally, it's also a particular pleasure, and I said immediately yes, because I had the honor to live in the United States of America for 7 years. It's where I finished my postgraduate studies and my PhD from the Johns Hopkins University. It's a country that gave me a lot, and therefore it's always a great pleasure to contribute to what I think is really one of the most critical relationships in the future, the India-US relationship, which is far below still its full potential, which I hope will, with the help of the Foundation for India Studies and many other community organizations, will reach its potential and flourish over the next years. So I think moving to the presentation, what I want to share with you today, let me pull up the PowerPoint. What I'll do today is I really try to put the India-China relation in the context of South Asia. And when I say South Asia, I'm looking at the countries that Nish mentioned in the introduction that have kept me busy over the last 10 years while studying this topic. That is not necessarily Pakistan. I think a lot of South Asia is focused on India-Pakistan relationships, the Kashmir dispute. Especially when we talk about South Asian studies, often it's about the history or the anthropological approaches to the subcontinent. But I'll look at the other countries that neighbor India. That is Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, the Maldives, Myanmar to a large extent too, towards the east. But most of these countries were countries that were very closely tied to India. Many people describe them as being in India's backyard. But the fact is that something changed over the last few years, which I'll try to share with you today, which is the appearance of China in this neighborhood. China was traditionally more focused on East Asia, Japan, Southeast Asia, Central Asia even. But over the last years, China has showed up really in India's neighborhood and is delivering financial support, is having a greater political influence, and that is creating a natural tensions between India and China, dynamics of competition. Sometimes India and China have cooperated also, but overall it is really competition and in some cases even the possibility of conflict. Now this has become particularly important over the last few months as you've seen India-China relations going south with the dispute in Ladakh and the conflict there. And that is translating into more competitive relations between India and China in Nepal, in Bangladesh, in Sri Lanka, in the Maldives, for example. So I'll try to share with you how this is playing out in these countries, but I'm happy in our Q&A to discuss other wider implications of the tensions between India and China. About Brookings India, where I work, as mentioned before, it is a part of the Brookings Institution in Washington, DC, headed by Mr. Vikram Singh Mehta, who's our chairman. We've existed now for 7 years here in New Delhi. It is an institution that is independent and actually fully funded in India with well-wishers and supporters from India, from a variety of sectors, particularly the private sector. And we really follow the best practices of the world's oldest and premier think tank, the Brookings Institution in Washington, DC, established in 1916. Our research seeks to contribute to improve governance in India. That is really the target. Focus on economics, energy, and the area I work on, foreign policy. We don't take any ideological or particular position as an institution. All of our researchers focus on their area of expertise, make it public, and try to reach out to a variety of stakeholders. This is exactly why I'm speaking today to you, because it's important to reach out and I think package the research we have to disseminate it to wider audiences in India, but also around the world. Coming to the topic of our talk here today, I think the most important issue is really that the neighborhood and these countries I mentioned before have often been very neglected in Indian studies, in Indian knowledge, in Indian universities, in Indian think tanks. This is a quote from Prime Minister Manmohan Singh speaking to the new diplomats who had joined the Foreign Service of India in 2008, 12 years ago. And at that point, he's actually said, the most important aspect of our foreign policy is the management of our relations with our immediate neighbors. We don't know adequately enough of what goes on in our neighborhood. Many times our own thinking about Nepal, Sri Lanka, etc., is influenced excessively by Western perceptions and knowledge of what's going on in these countries. So it's really identifying a knowledge gap. And that's really what's driven me to study this topic over the last 10 years. To give you a bit of a glimpse of my journey, to the top right is a picture when I first arrived in India to study at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, JNU in 2004. Then I studied, in many different areas. This is a picture of one cable from Prime Minister Nehru in 1954 in the Indian National Archives. So I did a lot of research on the archives, declassified documents that allowed me to understand how India's policies were made, a very important understanding of history so we can understand the present and also I think inform and try to improve policies of India in the future about its neighborhood. I did a lot of interviews with people around the region in Nepal and Sri Lanka and Myanmar. This is a picture of me with the former Prime Minister of Nepal, Madhav Kumar Nepal. In many ways, this was a journey for me over the last 15 years that I really encourage many of you, NRIs and PIOs around the world, in the US in particular, to also embark on, because it's a journey that brings you back to India and allows you to really contribute to greater knowledge about India here in India. And that was particularly rewarding for me because last year I received an award from the Indian Council of Cultural Relations. On the picture, you see the late Minister of External Affairs, Sushma Swaraji, who gave me the distinguished award of the ICCR alumni. So I was in 2004, when I came to India, I got a scholarship from the government of India to study India in India. And I hope many more people from the diaspora will follow this and will continue this stream of people returning to India to study India in India and not somewhere else. Of course, you can study India in many places, but I think nothing better than studying India in India. So this is the PhD work that I did on Nepal, Sri Lanka, and Myanmar, the archives I've mentioned to you, and the interviews, which also I have mentioned. So this region, and I like to put this as a caveat, because many of you will see that there's so many news about India's neighborhood policy. Now it is known as neighborhood first policy. And people love to say that neighborhood first or any neighborhood policy has been a total failure, a total success. You'll hear headlines and you'll see headlines about this everywhere. But I like this quote from one of the senior most retired now Indian diplomats who joined the Indian Foreign Service in 1952, Ambassador K. Shankar Bajpai. Because it really explains how difficult it is for India to be a regional power. It's not easy. There are many countries around India, many difficulties, geography, politics, different political regimes. He mentions, of course, the geography, jungles, mountains, deserts. He mentions different religions in South Asia, Buddhism, Islam, Hinduism, different ideologies, including communist regimes, dictatorships, monarchies, military dictatorships, like in Pakistan and Myanmar for a long time. Sometimes again, a Marxist democracies, very rarely a real democracy like India. India has really been an exception in this region. The geographic complexity is therefore exceptional, but that requires a lot of knowledge, skill, and flexibility in the way you try to get all your neighborhood ducks in a row, right? There's sometimes everything is looking good in India-Sri Lanka relations, but then things go south with Bangladesh. So it's a constant struggle to deal with this neighborhood. What I'll focus on today is the focus is China and how China, as I mentioned before, has shown up in this region. To your right is a picture of K. Subramaniam. He was an advisor to several governments on foreign and security policies in the 1970s, 80s, 90s, up to the 2000s, very influential in devising India's foreign policy. These quotes really tell you that when he says that people get very alarmed also by China or the United States or any other countries showing up in what is or used to be India's backyard or India's sphere of influence, he really says people should take a relaxed view, because in the long term, these are countries that have shared geography, culture, political, economic relations with India, and therefore sooner or later they will remain close to India. That is sort of the very positive attitude he took when he was writing in the 1980s. At the same time, he's also saying that India should be a realist country. India should be a pragmatic country. India shouldn't think that it must be loved by Nepal or Sri Lanka or Bangladesh. Any country that is big, that is large like India, that is really huge compared to its neighboring countries, will naturally be feared, disliked, but if it gets lucky, at least it will be respected. But it's almost impossible to have this country be loved by these smaller countries. And therefore, an elephant, which India really is in this region, a huge elephant, a huge country, right? Demography, geography, much larger than any of its neighbors, including Pakistan, should therefore not behave like a rabbit or a deer. It should actually behave like an elephant, which it is. And that's, I think, a metaphor of why he's saying India should be pragmatic. It should, of course, be considerate to its neighbors, but it cannot deny its reality as an elephant in this region. So how does this translate in India's foreign policies? In 1950, for example, Prime Minister Nehru was speaking about Nepal. And in this quote, he actually really says, Nepal is an independent political entity. We respect the sovereignty of Nepal as an independent country. But at the same time, he's really saying we cannot let anything happen that allows China, he's indirectly referring here to China and what's happening in Tibet at the point, cross into Nepal and affect the security of Nepal. Because what happens in Nepal affects India. And this is, as you see on this map, really the logic of geography. It's a next door neighbor that's very important for India. Everything happening in that neighboring country will also shape India. Similar in Sri Lanka in the 1980s, when India intervened militarily in Sri Lanka, Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi at that point says, we cannot afford to let hostile or external forces, he's actually referring to the United States here, to the UK, to many other Western countries. We cannot afford any of these other powers to interfere in what's happening in the Sri Lankan ethnic conflict between the Sinhala majority and the Tamil militants or rebels at that point or separatists. So there was this idea really that, you had political borders, but at the same time, you had a security region that transcended your political borders. And that gave India somehow the prerogative or special interests or rights to interfere, to use a strong word, in these neighboring countries and to shape whatever is happening in those countries. Conflicts, elections, foreign policies, economic policies in Sri Lanka, for example. India's always, of course, as the big country, therefore had a particular concern about the developments in those countries. What has this led to? In many ways, a very disconnected region. Why? Because India really was never part of the open economy in the rest of the world during the Cold War. The United States, of course, was the center of the capitalist free trade world. India adopted a protectionist socialist economy for 40 years. So this translated into India really erecting barriers between itself and its neighboring countries. Today, intra-regional trade in this region is around 5%. In Southeast Asia, it is almost 30%. So the whole world integrated, Europe integrated, North America through the old NAFTA integrated, South America through Mercosur integrated, Southeast Asia did. South Asia really split and was in many ways partitioned into different economies that traded very little with each other. To give you a few examples, land-based trade between India and Myanmar, that's a 1,500 kilometers long border, is less than what India trades in total with Nicaragua and Central America. So you see the lack of development of trade and connectivity between India and its neighboring countries. There are more weekly flights from Delhi to Bangkok and other regions in the Middle East, for example, than to immediate next door neighbors like Thimphu in Bhutan, Colombo, or Yangon in Myanmar. There are just 2 India-Bangladesh rail links today functioning. There were 12 until 1965 with what was East Pakistan, in many ways a hostile state. There's no functioning rail link today between India and Nepal. It's 3 times cheaper to ship a container from Delhi to Singapore than it is to next door Dhaka in Bangladesh. And it's easier for a US citizen to get a visa to visit India than a citizen to come to India from Bangladesh or Myanmar next door. So India in many ways is more connected to the rest of the world than it is to its next door neighbors. This was in many ways the state of disconnectivity of this region until the 1990s and even today. How has China really raised alarm bells and warnings in South Asia? China showed up with this new flagship initiative called the Belt and Road Initiative. And to that, it has really pumped in money for infrastructure development, for economic assistance, through grants, loans, through India's neighbors. In 2017, for example, India's Chinese trade with the region peaked at $56 billion, 3 times more than India itself traded with its own neighbors, right? This is immediately India's neighborhood. To your right, you see the succession of visits from the Chinese president since 2014 to 2019 in recent years, some of them after 30 years or 40 years, right? So there's been a diplomatic political outreach. Bottom level, on the bottom side, you have a picture of the various Belt and Road investments, right? In Pakistan, Central Asia, Sri Lanka, you see a great concentration of Chinese investments in Bangladesh and in Nepal also. How is this translated into actual changes on the ground? In Bangladesh, for example, a Chinese consortium, a proposal to invest in the Dhaka Stock Exchange. In 2017, the Chinese president announced a $24 billion economic package, 5 times at that point India's total loans and grants for Bangladesh. Bangladesh is the top recipient of Chinese defense supplies in the region. Nepal, for the first time ever, held a joint military exercise with the Chinese People's Liberation Army in 2017. Nepal also has become more wary to join, initiatives like BIMSTEC, regional initiatives that India has hosted. At the same time, also, for example, you now have a new optic fiber link connecting Nepal across the Himalayas with China, and maybe a new rail link actually crossing the Himalayas, things that were unthinkable a few decades ago. In Sri Lanka, for example, you have now 35% of foreign direct investment coming from China. That is almost the double of the share that India invests in Sri Lanka. So again, that economic primacy from China in Sri Lanka. The Hambantota port, of which you heard a lot about, I'm sure in the last few years in the news, has been the most visible example how the Chinese have developed infrastructure in these neighboring countries and then often end up owning them, at least in this case, for a 99% year lease in Sri Lanka. This is one interesting example that's come out of the research that I've been doing with my team at Brookings India. It is really about students coming to Indian universities or going to Chinese universities, students from the neighboring countries. These are students from Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Myanmar, Maldives, Nepal, and Sri Lanka, all next door neighbors to India, which you would expect would come to study at India's universities. So you can see the total number of students going to China in red, and in blue, the total number of students from these countries going to India. And as of 2016, that number is almost equal. That means that Sri Lankan and Bangladeshi students are now preferring as much, or going as many of them going to Chinese universities, much farther away with cultural differences, linguistic differences, than to next door Indian universities. And that tells you that the state of connectivity has become really a challenge for India in even issues like these soft power examples of education. This is, for example, the Chinese aid and Indian aid to Nepal, to give you another example of how China has really grown its presence in the region. As of the last 2-3 years, China, the blue line, has surpassed India, the orange line, in terms of economic assistance to Nepal. And that is, a development that is very recent, as you can see, and that is really pushing India now to react and do much more. So what is India doing more, and how is India reacting to this, rising China, especially under the current context of hostile relations with China over the last few months and over the last 2-3 years, I'd say, worsening of relations and of the state of relations with China. This is how Prime Minister Modi, when he came to power in 2014, he went to the United Nations General Assembly in New York, and he announced India's Neighborhood First policy, and he defines it as India's quest for a peaceful and stable regional environment. A nation's destiny is linked first and foremost to its immediate neighborhood. That is what my government has placed. That's why my government has placed the highest priority on advancing friendship and cooperation and connectivity to, in many ways, correct what I have described, that state of disconnectivity, that state of long neglect of the neighborhood that had started to become correct in the 2000s, but really became a top priority since 2014. Let me give you a few examples to try to convince you of how important this has become in terms of the policies over the last few years. And there's 3 main reasons why India has done this. The first one I've already described is the rise of China. So when China is doing more in Nepal and Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, India feels, pressure to deliver, counter, compete, and upgrade its own delivery mechanisms to offer more economic support to Nepal, to modernize its infrastructure, to support more scholarships for Sri Lankan students to come to study in India, to support, for example, Bangladesh military officials to come and be trained in India. These are the responses to China. But there's also an economic growth story. I think India is much more interested now in the neighborhood because the neighborhood of South Asia is growing economically. So there's growth, there's investment opportunities for Indian companies, there's growing trade with its neighboring countries. So this is in many ways the second driver. Finally, something you probably have heard also a lot over the last few years is that for this government in particular, for Prime Minister Modi, there's a constant focus on cultural diplomacy, on the importance of an India that transcends its political borders because it is somehow connected through civilizational, cultural, religious ties to its neighboring countries, especially more than the West or Southeast Asia or Africa. And that has been sort of a cultural vision, in particular since 2014, that has driven India's neighborhood first policy. What has that led to in terms of practice so far, in terms of the achievements in many ways that I think often are forgotten because there's so many critical reporting about India's neighborhood first policy that we forget that there's been a sea change really in achievements over the last few years that begins in the 2000s, but it really accelerates post 2014. In just 6 years, Prime Minister Modi between 2014 and 19 made 13 official visits to neighboring countries. This excludes China, right? Just these neighboring countries, compared to just 5 by Prime Minister Manmohan Singh in 2 terms in 10 years. He became the first prime minister to undertake a official state visit to Sri Lanka in almost 40 years, if you exclude multilateral visits and a short visit by Rajiv Gandhi in 1987 for a military intervention. For example, in 2016 also, Manohar Parrikar became the first defense minister ever to visit next door Bangladesh. Infrastructure. There are now many new checkposts on India's borders that have been expanding, and several more are in expansion with Nepal, Bangladesh, and Myanmar. The number of railway connections with Bangladesh increased from just 1 in 2008 to 4, and maybe 6 more planned now in the future years. The new first South Asian cross-border pipeline has now just been inaugurated. There's a new South Asian satellite supporting telemedicine and teleeducation for India's neighbors, launched by ISRO recently. For the first time, a flight from South India, from Chennai, landed in Jaffna Airport after almost 40 years after India supported the modernization of the Jaffna Airport in Sri Lanka through a grant. Organizational changes. You have, several diplomatic relations with India and Nepal accelerating over the last years. For example, the biennial commission that was supposed to meet every 2 years met after 23 years for the first time again in 2016. There's a new Indo-Pacific division very focused on regional connectivity now in the Ministry of External Affairs here in Delhi. At the state level, states have been very focused on neighborhood first because they recognize that they will grow more by being connected to neighboring countries. The Assam state, for example, now has an Act East division that connects to Bangladesh and Myanmar and pursues that policy. There's a new consulate of Bhutan now in Guwahati, Assam. And Bhutan now, for the first time, exported goods through inland waterways, Indian inland waterways to Bangladesh. You have a new policy towards BIMSTEC and BBIN, which are 2 important regional mechanisms beyond just SAARC, the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, and those 2 have been revived over the last years. India signed an important TIR convention that allows the movement of containers on trucks in South Asia. There's now an electronic cargo tracking system for Nepali cargo to access India's eastern ports, making it much easier for Nepal to trade with India through Indian ports. There are now inland waterway navigation agreements being discussed with Nepal and Bangladesh, which will make it very easy, for example, for Nepal to export its cargo through the Ganga River all the way to the Kolkata Haldia port into the Bay of Bengal. And many of these inland waterways had been stagnant for 40 years and are being revived now. There's now a land boundary agreement, which you've seen announced in 2015 with Bangladesh, which had been negotiated for 40 years, finally signed, and also a coastal shipping agreement with Bangladesh. Let me give you more examples about financial incentives. Now you have critical infrastructure being developed in India's 17 border states under the Border Area Development Program. National highways and rail networks being expanded to what it's called the last mile connectivity, especially in the northeast region of India, connecting with Bangladesh and with Myanmar. There's now a concessional finance scheme that supports Indian companies that want to support infrastructure projects, for example, in the hydropower sector in Nepal and Bhutan, in the energy sector in Sri Lanka, for example. And I mentioned, the rail and road connectivity in the Northeast. Finally, there's also a larger connectivity system, and not only in South Asia with your neighborhood, but also an expanded neighborhood, right? It's not only about these countries, it's also about connecting South Asia with Southeast Asia, for example, under the SASEC program under the Asian Development Bank. That means you're trying to connect the eastern coast of India through the Bay of Bengal with the ASEAN states. You have projects that you're doing in other countries in the neighborhood together with Japan and the United States, which is very new. Traditionally, India was doing a lot of this alone. Now it's actually partnering together with Japan and the US to build infrastructure in Sri Lanka, for example. It is coordinating with the US on many of these initiatives, for example, on an electricity connectivity project with Nepal. It's working together to develop a new terminal in Sri Lanka, Colombo port, together with Japan. And it's working much closer also with the World Bank and other banks and financial institutions. All of this, to many ways, counter what China has been doing in India's region. And this speaks also about what's called the middle power diplomacy. That means that India is much more comfortable today to work together with Japan, which I've mentioned before, the United States, Australia, the European Union, many other sort of like-minded countries, which Prime Minister Modi refers to India having shared values and interests with. And he says this is completely normal to work together in formats of 3 or more for a stable and peaceful region in South Asia. This is very different from, say, 20, 30 years ago when India was quite reluctant to have, other, like I mentioned that Rajiv Gandhi quote from 1987, to let other countries come into its own sort of, if I may use the term, backyard and its own regional sphere of influence. So that has changed. And you have an India that is much more comfortable now to work with other regional powers to try to compensate for its own weaknesses and lag and neglect in its neighborhood policy to respond to what China is doing. What is coming ahead in terms of challenges? I think one thing that is very important that we often forget when we speak about Chinese economic infrastructure, the Belt and Road Initiative, the Chinese supporting Nepal, as I shared in one of my slides, through huge economic assistance, when the Chinese developed the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka, when they buy a share in the Dhaka Stock Exchange in Bangladesh, when they're getting close to Pakistan. There's a whole economic story that we hear a lot about. But it's very interesting to see how the Chinese are using that economic influence to shape the politics of those countries, to interfere in the politics of those countries, to put pressure on the media reporting about Hong Kong, Tibet, Xinjiang, to put pressure on universities in Nepal or in Sri Lanka to study China, only from a very particular positive angle. How the Chinese are buying space in the media and supporting fellowships to really influence the coverage of South Asian media of China. So you have now a variety of publicity, and if I may use the word propaganda from China, that is trying to shape the media coverage of China in South Asia, including in India. How China is also trying to play kingmaker when it comes to elections and government formation in these countries. Recently, there was a crisis in Nepal, and China in the background tried to shape and pursue, its own interest to get a particular government in place. No, nothing of this should surprise us. The United States of America has done this during the Cold War. The Soviet Union did so. India did so in many ways in these countries for a long time. What's happening is that China showed up and really has now become a major power, also doing this in India's immediate sphere of influence. And that is going to be very interesting because China comes in with a particular baggage. And this is where I think there's a difference between India doing so. India is a democracy. India has always recognized that democratic elections are important, that the free media is important in Sri Lanka and Nepal. India recognizes the importance of democratic government, of a free media, of academic independence. It generally recognizes that as a principled, important interest in India's neighborhood relations. China comes in, of course, reflecting its own model, which is a one-party state, a communist state that just doesn't get the importance of the rule of law, of an independent judiciary system, of free elections. So it will always be very skeptical about democracy in South Asia, including in Pakistan, in Nepal, in Bangladesh, in Sri Lanka, in the Maldives. Second, of course, the Chinese relations with Pakistan have developed tremendously over the last few years. For a long time, China-Pakistan relations were focused on political, diplomatic, and even military security relations. The economic angle under what's called the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, CPEC, has become very important over the last 10 years. And that is an initiative that is really tying the Pakistani economy to a corridor connecting Pakistan to China and to the Indian Ocean region, the Gulf states, Central Asia, and Afghanistan. And in many ways, it's pulling Pakistan away from what we used to know as South Asia. So the China-Pakistan partition border is becoming more and more solid and salient in recent years, because China is really making Pakistan to gravitate north, south, and west, and not east anymore. So Pakistan used to look at much more at sort of its eastern front, at India. There were a lot of attempts to normalize relations with India, but that is coming to an end in many ways. Because India also is looking more and more in the other direction. India is looking, as you see in the policies of Neighborhood First and Act East, towards Myanmar, towards Southeast Asia, towards the Bay of Bengal, southwards towards the Indian region. So in many ways, we have a split between the Indian and the Pakistani state in terms of their geostrategic horizons. India looking east and south, Pakistan looking north, west, and north and west. A big challenge for India is going to be economic openness and interdependence. India only opened up its economy in 1990, 1991. And in many ways, the logic of economic free trade, openness, is still not seen as an important objective for the Indian government. You see it in India's hesitations to open up its economy. You see it in Prime Minister Modi's recent speech, again emphasizing self-reliance. You see it in the hike in import tariffs in many sectors in recent years, in the last 2 years in particular. You see it in India's reluctance to join the RCEP trade agreement towards Asia. You see it in the delay of what used to be a very ambitious India-US free trade agenda that has collapsed. You see it in the delays of an India-European Union free trade agreement that was first discussed in 2007 and has been stagnant since 2014. So there's still a lot of reluctance about opening the Indian economy. And if you don't open the Indian economy towards Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and your neighboring countries, it's going to be very difficult to integrate this region and reconnect this region like it used to be. Finally, it's also very important for India to understand the sensitivities of its neighboring countries. You know, often in India now, the buzzword is connect, connect, connect. And I gave you many examples of why this neighborhood first policy has focused on that in the right trend, in the right direction. At the same time, however, if you are sitting in Bhutan, if you are sitting in Nepal, if you're sitting in Bangladesh, you're going to be quite reluctant or at least skeptical about this big elephant India telling you, we want to connect, we want to get closer to you, we want to integrate our economies with you, we want to develop cross-border infrastructure. These are smaller countries with smaller demographic, with smaller populations, with smaller economies that are always going to be concerned about it getting too close to India. And that's why exactly they see China as seeing, this very important alternative that gives them alternatives. They're going to be much more interested in connecting with Southeast Asia or with China or with the United States, which are far away. The grass is always looking green at the other side of the fence, right? And next door you have India, which is your immediate neighbor and is always going to be seen from a threatening perspective. And that is important for India to navigate that. So India at the same time wants to go very fast in connectivity, but it also has to be, I think, cognizant of the sensitivities of these neighboring countries. This leads me to the important next point about the importance of cultural unity as an important narrative in India's foreign policy, which I mentioned before. You want to talk about civilizational ties with Nepal, for example, right? That we are close, that Ram and Sita have this important partnership because one is born in Nepal, the other one in India, and therefore there's a Hindu element that connects India and Nepal. You talk about Buddhism and the importance of India and Sri Lanka sharing the language of Buddha, right? And Prime Minister Modi went for the Buddha Jayanti celebrations, I think 2 years ago, especially on a visit to mark that. At the same time, some of these countries are going to be nervous about this, right? Because for India, it may make sense to say that India has an identity that is a greater India, cultural and religious and civilizational links with all these neighboring states. But if you are sitting again in Kathmandu, in Colombo, or in other countries in the neighborhood, you're going to be concerned about the idea that this somehow is one great India, and that you're going to lose your independence, your distinctiveness, your authenticity, and in many ways your difference with India. One challenge will also be, I've mentioned to you that India is much more comfortable working with Japan and the US in these third countries, but that's still work in progress. So it's going to be a constant push and shove, which we had till 2017. Do you get closer to the Chinese or closer to the Americans? I would say, taking this forward, as relations between India and China get worsen, India will be much more interested to get closer to the United States, to Japan, to Australia, to Europe, to work in this neighborhood and in the wider Indian Ocean region. I'll just end with this. I think this is the Samban initiative, which is a project, if you're more interested about this, that I'm running at Brookings India. So we're really looking connectivity from many factors and indicators, like I've mentioned before: education, trade, defense, media, culture, environment. And we're really trying to map how India is reconnecting with its immediate neighbors. And I'll just end with a few reading suggestions. If you're more interested in this area of broader India-China relations, India in the neighborhood, and Indian foreign policy, these are 8 excellent books I recommend by people that have been either in government or are excellent young scholars that are doing path-breaking new research on India's foreign and security policies. Nish, I'll end at this and happy to pass on to you for any questions and the Q&A. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Dr. Xavier, for the insightful and really informative lecture. I feel like I've learned so much just in this short time, and I know that the community is really engaged because I see a number of questions that are popping up on the Q&A screen below. So again, I just want to remind everyone about the procedure here for Q&A. If anyone has questions, please type it into the Zoom. Please list your name and your country or where you're asking from so we can give people credit. Or you can type it in anonymously, but that's a little bit less fun. So before we get into the written Q&A, we have one honorary guest that we want to have come in and ask a verbal question onto the Zoom. This is Colonel Dr. Raj Balla, who is a pillar of the Houston Indo-American community and a close friend and advisor of FIS. Colonel Dr. Balla brings a rich professional and experiential background. He joined the Indian military in 1953 and retired as a colonel there in 1973 after serving in active war operations during the Indian-Pakistan War of 1971. After retiring from the Indian Army, Colonel Dr. Balla came to the United States in 1976 and was recruited by Charles River Laboratories, of which he became a president of in 1982, before ultimately retiring in 2006 at the age of 76. Dr. Balla has been in Houston since 1991, and ever since he's been there, he's been a leader, a presence, and I'd say personally a good friend to the Indian community. Among other accolades, Dr. Balla is a former vice chairman of the Gurdwara Sahib of Southwest Houston. He's a past president of the India Culture Center, a past director of the Indo-American Political Action Committee, and a past member of the advisory board and current member of the advisory board of Foundation for India Studies. Professionally, Dr. Balla has a doctorate in veterinary medicine from India and a master's degree from the University of Minnesota. So please, everyone, join me in welcoming Colonel Dr. Raj Balla to ask the first honorary question of our Q&A session.
Okay. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, Dr. Balla, but we can't see you yet. So please turn on your video.
No, the host has to probably, I am pushing my video. It doesn't, okay, well, here we go. All right. Thank you so much, Nish, for the introduction. And thank you so very much, Dr. Xavier, for your brilliant talk that was so interesting and educated. But see, my question is, Brookings being the prestigious think tank, what options does India have? Given $50 billion deficit with trade with China, many startups and industries in India are now being actually financed by Chinese investors, and they're highly sophisticated military. Not that I'm putting down Indian Army, which is probably one of the top militaries in the world, But you see, after all, you have to have a level playing field. They have been so far, now things are improving. But given the situation as of now, we are not yet there. That's what I mean. And then hostile Pakistan, and now not so friendly Nepal, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and possibly Afghanistan, where they have now started talking with Taliban. So what kind of situation or what options? You have mentioned, all this economic thing, and then we also claim regarding this Vasudeva Kutumbam, we are one family, the whole world is one family. But it doesn't go any far these days. And that is the predicament, and that's why the question.
Thank you, Colonel Bala, for the question. So Dr. Xavier, I think what we're asking here is mostly centered around what are India's strategic, realistic options given kind of this changing environment with both China and its neighbors?
Yeah, thank you, Nish. Thank you, Dr. Bala. As I mentioned before, I just wish we could have much more time to speak to you, because we have so much to learn. I mean, someone who joined the Indian Army in 1953, that is what I'm reading in the archives. You have seen it with your own eyes. You have implemented it. You have practiced what I'm trying to study. So happy to chat with you more. But your question, I think, is spot on. What the environment is looking grim, right? And the situation. You had a traditional superpower, the United States of America, that has normalized its relations over the last few years with India since the 2000s. Phenomenal rapprochement between India and the US, of which I'm sure many of you have played a very important role in driving that normalization of relations. And you, sir, for sure will remember how bad relations were between India and the US for many decades. And post-2000s, I think that has been a first trend that has brought India closer to the US, based on many shared values that were there before, but have facilitated the relation, right? And the diaspora, through democracy, has been able to push the US closer to India. The importance of the economic relationship between the US as trade has grown. In fact, the US is now has been consistently one of the most important trade partners of India. And I think those two factors, the democratic values, economic relations, have really brought those countries together. On China, on the other hand, you've seen ups and downs in the relationship, but really consistent worsening of the relationship between India and China over the last few years. But more than worsening of relations, I think the economic factor you mentioned is very important. On any indicator, GDP per capita income, in terms of top number of universities in the top 100 ranking, China is outranking India, right? In terms of GDP and economic factors, generally by a factor of 5 or 6. In terms of universities, for example, if I'm not mistaken, China has, I think, close to 3 to 5 universities now in the top 100 or 150. India doesn't have a single university showing up in the top 100 global universities. So my short answer to you, really, in this triangle of the only thing that will take India forward is economic capabilities, right? Economic reforms and greater economic power. That is what will give India the heft, the leverage, the respect worldwide, right? Because it is that economic interdependence that gives you leverage. And here, in fact, that is what India could actually learn from China. If you see what the Chinese have done under a communist one-party-led state since 1978, under the visionary leadership, right, of Deng Xiaoping, let's admit that and let's recognize it, is open up its economy and integrated it with Japan, Korea, Southeast Asia, and the United States of America. And it is that economic power and leverage and the modernization of its infrastructure and the modernization of its economy at home that allows it now to use that to coerce, to pressure other countries, right? And now in many ways, we see a China that has come out to become much more aggressive, much more hostile in many ways, for good reasons or bad reasons, doesn't matter, but it gives it that power. So the short answer to you is that India will only be able to do this by opening up its economy, strengthening its economic relations with important strategic partners. I would say the US, Japan, Australia, Southeast Asia in particular, but also other important markets, the European Union, Africa, Latin America. I mean, all these markets are very important for India's exports and to attract investments into India. And in its neighborhood in particular, which I try to argue here today in this lecture, open up its economy, but more importantly, develop its critical infrastructure. How can you trade with Nepal if you don't have a railway link with Nepal? How can you trade with Nepal if you don't have a modern, integrated border checkposts on your border where trucks can you smoothly transit through with goods, right? Today, it takes you sometimes up to a day to clear a truck of import or exports between India and Nepal. So I think that economic infrastructure, which I've shared today, is key for India to get closer to its neighbors. The rest, let the Chinese do what they want. I mean, the time will tell whether they're doing well or not, and we'll have other opportunities to discuss that. But I think the economic and infrastructure integration and agendas are going to be key for India in its neighborhood and globally.
Okay, just one second. Nish, I'll just speak. I 100% agree with you, but the bottom line is, in the meanwhile, we are losing ground. You see the incursion, they are coming in. And then I think side by side, militarily, we should be putting more into that. And that's what I think. But it's very good. What you said, fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bala and Dr. Xavier. Wow, what an incredible, engaging answer and really sets the stage for the rest of our Q&A here. So as you could probably see, we're nearing our end time, but we're going to hold over for a bit longer here, I think, because there's so many questions. 24 people so far have asked questions. That's nearly 70% of participants. So if no one minds, Dr. Xavier, I know you are very busy, but if you don't mind, we're going to hold you over here a little bit longer so we can get some of these questions answered. So the first question I'm going to ask here is from Atmaram. He didn't list where they're asking from, but their question is that both India and China are working and striving on becoming global powers in various spheres, and China seems to be leveraging its economic investments for long-term benefits. At the same time, India is dealing with domestic issues and may not be able to match up to China's economy, sort of in line with what you were saying earlier. In this situation, how can India match up to be the big elephant with its neighbors when China has so much more economic clout?
Yeah, thank you, Nish, and thank you, Mr. Ram. I'll take these very shortly, Nish, okay? Because I think that's excellent questions. So I'll try to go very quickly, give very short and quick pointed answer at these because I'm really keen to engage with several excellent questions I'm seeing pop up here. I mean, I've taken this question mostly already, I think, on the economic and the infrastructural investments. I think the importance is like looking at that K. Subramaniam quote I mentioned before, is take the long-term view, right? If you're going to focus on little border skirmishes now and on day-to-day affairs, and nothing will work. The tactical decisions will not work. I think India needs to take a long-term strategic vision focused on economic modernization and infrastructure development at home and in its neighborhood. That will take care of most problems. That is at least my view.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Xavier. The next question here I have is from Sankalp Ban and Ignacio Celis Aguirre. I think Sankalp Ban is in Houston and Mr. Aguirre is in New York. They're asking about the recent, or I guess the upcoming American election. So it's two questions here. How do you think the upcoming election is going to influence Indo-Chinese relations? And does a Biden-Harris ticket have any implications on US foreign policy with India or China that you're aware of or concerned with?
Okay, so this is something many of my colleagues are more equipped to discuss, and many of you actually sitting in the US and being part of US politics. But I look at it from a very large picture, and I think the US and India, whoever comes and goes in the White House, are poised to get closer to each other. As relations with China worsen between India and China, that is also a structural tendency that is unavoidable. India-China relations may go to ups and downs, but they will, on the average, deteriorate over the next few years. Similarly, I'd say India-US relations will go to ups and downs. And we've seen some downs under the Trump administration. I think we all have to recognize that. But in many ways, I think the long-term relationship is one of convergence between India and the US. Whoever wins the election, whether it's President Trump again or Vice President Biden.
Great, wow. Another great answer to a very difficult question. So I have a question here that I think is really interesting. This is from an anonymous asker, I think maybe from Nepal, but it's essentially, how would you respond, or how should India respond to criticisms that it's a big bully in its interactions with its neighbors, such as Nepal?
So I think that's why, again, I put that quote about India being an elephant. And I'd mentioned so many times that the image of India in its neighborhood will always be negative, right? I mean, if you're a smaller animal in the jungle, you're going to fear that elephant, especially when it gets mad or upset or just wants to take its stroll, right? Any stroll by an elephant can be deadly for other countries. So I think here India can invest in delivering more. And delivering more economic assistance in connecting with its neighboring countries through this whole infrastructure I've mentioned: roads, railways, airports, port access, trade relationships. That is what these countries need. Nepal has a huge demand for infrastructure financing. If it will not get it from Indian companies, it will go for Chinese companies, European or American companies. And that's not necessarily bad, but there are demands in these neighboring countries. And India is either going to connect like it is already, and I think that is why I shared with you today these many successes of India really pushing to connect with these countries. Now, one thing India needs to avoid as a big bully is to play too much, I think, of this game of political interference, right? You want to take a long-term view, stay away, and not be micromanaging these countries, right? You want to connect, deliver to Bangladesh, to Sri Lanka, to the Maldives, be supportive of their modernization plans. In fact, Bangladesh is poised to become a lower middle income country now. This was a country that was seen as an example of absolute poverty just 20 years ago. So these countries are doing quite well, actually. They don't need India as much as they needed India 20 or 30 years ago. So it's up to India in many ways to deliver more and have a very positive agenda in terms of its neighborhood first policy, both in words, but also in deeds.
Great. This is a question here I think is very interesting from an anonymous attendee that I want to get answered. It says, please talk about India becoming a Hindu state and how that will affect India's relationships with neighbors and friendly states. And of course, I think that's a reference to the BJP party and the kind of meteoric rise of Prime Minister Modi. So what do you think that cultural aspect has had an effect on relationships or further relationships with our neighbors?
Yeah, so my presentation addressed a bit of that, as you saw, in terms of the concerns that excessive emphasis on cultural, religious commonalities will affect India's relations, right? Because all these countries want to be different from India. At the same time, if you, of course, focus too much on your unique and exclusive majoritarian Hindu identity, non-Hindu countries, the other ones, and I'd say Bangladesh in particular, for example, but also the Maldives, will be very concerned about that. And in fact, this has contributed to some tensions in India-Bangladesh relations, right? Because if you're telling a certain number of people within India that you are not Indian citizens, for example, the question will arise, whose citizens are there and where will they go, right? And that's why Bangladesh was naturally concerned when, in Assam, there were policies now to, identify the populations and register them as citizens or not. At the same time, I think, in the end, these countries want to focus on good economic relations with India, on good security relations, and therefore identity politics make it easily into the news. And in Bangladesh, many people will say this really is of concern, but in reality, as long as India really delivers, I think on a lot of issues it has not delivered, it will be actually doing most of its job in the neighborhood policy. So I think cultural emphasis on a Hindu state, for example, may affect India's relations, but not as much as I think many people believe by going by the news and the reportage we have these days.
Great. So the next question here I have is from Sita Mutalia in Dallas, and she says, or she asks, is there any chance of India's democracy influencing China or China moving more towards a democratic norm?
So we hope, so we have dreamt, so we have been disappointed. I think that's the story of the last 10 to 15 years, right? Everyone believed, and maybe some people still believe, I'm not sure, but that somehow, by, reaching out to the Chinese, bringing them into the institutions and dealing with them, that it could be somehow convinced and shaped to become more reasonable abroad and more democratic at home. And there was hope in the 2000s. There were actually good reasons for hope, because in fact, in the 2000s, there were within the Chinese system, some experiments in decentralization, in very timid democratization. But one thing that Xi Jinping has brought is, I think, the clarity, the president of China, the clarity that no such possibility is really in the near horizon, that there is an increasingly authoritarian China at home with central rule by a leader that is empowered as never before. And at the same time, also correlated to that, I think on the external front, a more aggressive China that is not going to become very reasonable and is not going to play ball in the many institutions the United States, Europe, and India have invested in over the last decades. So I think similarly also, it's unreasonable to somehow think that the Chinese will respect democracies abroad. Everything the Chinese have shown us over the last 3 to 4 years now is that they have penetrated democracies and tried to often undermine democracies in Europe, in the US, in Canada, in Australia, and including in India's neighborhood, as in the case of Nepal, which I have discussed today.
Great. I have the next question here from Nicholas in Houston. I think he's asking about, what is the process for India to modernize its economy? And I know you touched on that briefly, but I think he maybe wants a more granular answer here. And his question is about, do you think India will pursue an economic policy more similar to that of the United States in the 1930s, or will it focus on external economic integration as a tool to achieve economic modernity?
So again, I think you would have to speak to an expert economist that is tracking this, but I'll tell you what are my senses here from Delhi as I speak to my colleagues and read my colleagues' work on India's economy. India is actually very trade dependent for its own economy. India also is seen as a major market by most companies that want to invest here. Whether you talk to American companies, whether you do surveys among Japanese companies, especially now after China's pandemic and COVID, there are many companies trying to relocate, leave China. That is also more consumer driven now, and internal consumers becoming a bit more protectionist in its own way. So there are many companies trying to divert and looking at other markets, and India is showing up consistently as the most desired market to invest in. At the same time, paradoxically, India tops the rankings and the tables and the lists of economies that are very difficult to do business with, right? Major investors that are coming to India complain about excessive red tape, bureaucracies, center-state tensions, protectionism, inbuilt and legal, sort of a formal protectionism, but also non-trade barriers, non-tariff barriers. So India is a very difficult economy to invest in. India is also an economy that I would classify largely as an economy that is not really invested in interdependence with other economies. That is protecting its own big companies. There are some companies that are very big in India, as you know. These companies have in many ways an oligopoly in many sectors, or almost a monopoly. If you look at the telecommunications sector, at the infrastructure sector, and those companies are not very keen in opening up India's market to competition from abroad. Retail market, we saw this with the US, right? The whole discussion going on and on. And I think, therefore, that is a major challenge, right? Especially for someone like Prime Minister Modi, who came in with a strong reformist agenda on the economy and actually hasn't really delivered on most of the reforms he has promised. Some of them are work in progress, but that remains, I think, a big challenge.
Wow. Another very insightful answer. You could have fooled me about being an expert on the Indian economy, Dr. Xavier. So the next question here is from Amol Shalia in Houston, Texas. And he's asking about whether you think it's too late for Western governments to apply sort of a containment policy on China, similar to what emerged in Western powers following the rise of the Soviet Union.
Excellent question, because this is really a question about the patterns of history and whether we should replicate them and whether we should take the same policy. You know, I think the big difference from the 1940s onwards to today is that you could afford economically to contain the Soviet Union. There were in many ways two parallel economies in the world, the socialist economy and the free trade economy under the US umbrella. Today, you have a deeply integrated, interdependent economy. I mean, I spoke about the US, but China is actually, again, with the US, the top trading partner of India. So you can sanction as much as you want China and its exports, like the current Indian government is trying to do, right? And trying to push back on the economy. But in effect, you are dependent on Chinese exports to keep your economic growth. That creates a tremendous problem. Therefore, you have now this focus on self-reliance. But at the same time, self-reliance in an interdependent global economy where there are complex supply chains, right? Where you're not producing your good from within your own economy is going to be very difficult. You're going to have to be integrated in supply chains that connect Japan to Southeast Asia to India, Europe to the Gulf to India, the American economy with the European economy to India. That openness is key. So you're going to have to be very selective about where you open up and how you contain China. And that's, I think, a game everyone is still trying to learn, because everyone is equally exposed to the Chinese economy. The United States of America, right. President Trump can say whatever he wants, but we've seen how difficult it is to decouple the American economy from the Chinese economy without huge political costs, without huge massive unemployment, without huge costs to the American consumption patterns of its economy. So those are the challenges I think all economies are facing as they deal with China.
Great. That's a great answer. And I think this actually leads up very well to the next question we have here. This is from Sirjan Ulyevich from the American University of Central Asia in Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan. And he wants to know if you could please explain the difference between strategic autonomy and non-alignment. And I think that kind of fits in with these questions of India's interactions with the broader economy and with China and these other countries.
Yeah, I think, it's a long debate, a very philosophical debate, but I think non-alignment was many ways a means towards an end. The idea of non-alignment meant that by not getting into any camp, the Soviet camp or the American camp, by keeping your options open, right? By having relations with the US, with the Soviet Union, with Europe, with many other countries and important players in the world, you would enhance your strategic autonomy in the Cold War. You would keep autonomous. That doesn't mean independent. No country is completely, totally independent. Even a superpower like the US, like we're seeing now, is not independent. It's integrated with the Chinese economy and it cannot afford to take decisions at will. I think similar for India, the idea has always been, since 1947, to enhance its strategic autonomy through non-alignment, through relations with the Soviet Union, to balancing India relations with Soviet Union and with the US, post-Soviet Union, by diversifying your relations, getting closer to the Europeans, getting closer to Japan, getting closer to Japan. And that slide ahead about middle power diplomacy is in many ways that. I think when Prime Minister Modi speaks that he wants to get closer to a variety of countries with which it shares some interests and values, it reflects that India wants to, in many ways, spread its eggs into different baskets, right? To ensure that it doesn't depend only on the Soviet Union, that it doesn't depend only on the United States of America, like Japan, for its own security, depended as a treaty ally of the United States of America, only on the United States of America for its security. I think India could always afford not to depend on anyone because it played this very smart game of strategic autonomy through many different policies. And today, again, you don't want to have a dependence on the United States of America, and you also don't want to be exposed to this new China that is becoming more aggressive. So you're going to have to find new baskets and put different eggs into different baskets.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Xavier. We're nearing the end of our time here. We've been 15 minutes over and we've just had so many amazing questions. I see over 30 on here, which is, so many. And we're extremely thankful to everyone who's participated here in this Q&A process. As we're going to wrap up here, what I'll tell you is that we'll do our best to try to answer these questions and submit to everyone who's on here via email after the event. Just kind of brief answers to as many of these as we can. So if you have a question, please ask it now and we'll try to address it later. I think we might have time for one last question here, Dr. Xavier, if you're happy with
Fine.
it.
If you could take a few more, I'll take a few more rapid fire ones.
Okay, great.
I don't want to disappoint. It's excellent questions I'm seeing here.
Well, this question here is from Shori. It doesn't say who that person is, but I'll say an anonymous asker. In light of the recent events originating from China, which I think is referring to maybe both the coronavirus and the recent tensions at the China-India border, what course should India follow to not lose territory militarily as well as economically in the region?
Yeah, so I think there's many ways in which India is sovereign. It has land, territory, which we always focused. And of course, people are very upset when China attacks and crosses those lines and grabs Indian territory like it did. And changes the status quo like it has over the last 3 months, 4 months. At the same time, I would look at territory and Indian sovereignty also in many other ways. The economy is a sovereign space. India's democracy is a sovereign space. You don't want to lose the health of free elections and of a free India. The cyberspace of India is a free space that India wants to preserve, right? There is energy security. You don't want to have Chinese hacking into the energy systems of India and affecting India's sovereign electrical grid system. So you have India's naval space, right, in the maritime domains where shipping and oil and trade comes and goes through Indian ports. So any Chinese activity that is hostile to that could again affect India's economic security, India's food security, India's energy security. So I think the game is being played out in many, many different levels, not only in the Himalayas up in Ladakh. In fact, I don't want to minimize that in any way. It is a very important issue and it's been very disappointing how China has behaved there. But at the same time, I think India needs to focus on the many other aspects. That's why I gave you that slide on education, for example. If Indian universities are not able to attract the best students and talent from worldwide to come and study at Indian universities, what does it tell you about innovation and education in India? What does it tell you about Chinese universities that are able to attract more and more students from across Asia? Those are the long-term agendas where India is going to have change its policy in order to remain a sovereign, important, capable power in the international system.
Wow, and another great answer, Dr. Xavier. Thank you so much. I think I'm going to do the last question here since we're coming up on the 50 mark. So this question is from Atmaram, I think also from Houston, Texas. And he is asking, what is India's strategy going to be in Africa? Because Africa is sort of this new big economic battleground where we've seen China putting in a huge amount of influence and money and power. Is India going to be able to match that? And what should their strategy be in order to kind of gain influence there?
So I think I used to do some work on Africa 10 years ago on India-Africa relations, but not much. And I think Africa has become very important as an export market for Indian companies. So you see, for example, Japan and India developing something called the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor, AAGC, or at least they played around with that idea for some time. I don't know where it stands now, but the idea is really to connect the African growth markets. And let's not forget, across Africa, and especially in sub-Saharan Africa, record economic growth rates now to the Indian Ocean and the Indian market, and then to Southeast Asia and East Asia and Japan in particular. So that's going to be very important for India's, again, economic connectivity in its wider neighborhood, the Gulf countries, again, too. But let me also mention one issue, Anish, I think, which is very important. I think for a long time, many of us believed that you could do business with the Chinese and then somehow do politics, governance, strategy, foreign policy, cultural relations with the ones you share more values with, right? So India and the US can have close relations, but let's do business with the Chinese and trade. I think the last few years have really opened many people's eyes towards the natural, not surprising. I think no one should have been under that illusion that by doing business with the Chinese, you're going to have to compromise on your values, on your political systems, on your strategic autonomy in many ways. Right. And I think that is really coming out across, especially post-pandemic and post-February or post-December last year when the Wuhan crisis began with the pandemic beginning in China. And there are differences. It's not about what system do we prefer living in. Is it a US democratic system, the Indian amazing democratic elections where 800 million plus people vote freely in elections, right? And come out and express their voice freely in this amazing successful experiment called Democratic India for 70 years plus. It's not just a moral luxury. It has tremendous implications in the way these countries are organized, in the way we respond, for example, like we respond to a virus. Look at how China responded to a virus, through a lack of transparency, by shutting down systems, by not letting information come out from cities and even across the world. Look at how India is addressing COVID, through openness, by sharing information domestically between different states and also internationally, by supporting and sharing information with Europe, with the US, with other countries. So these are fundamentally two different systems. The Chinese systems, the Chinese authoritarian communist system with all its plus, but also cons. And I think the Indian system with all its plus, but also with its cons and negatives. And we shall see over the next years, it's going to be very exciting to see which system will prevail and will prove to become more attractive to other countries, the US in particular, where I think there's no illusion that the US feels particularly attracted to the Indian system and shares those values of openness, transparency, and democracy with India.
Wow, thank you so much, Dr. Xavier. That was an amazing answer and a great way, I think, to wrap up our lecture and Q&A here, because it's really focusing on what are the next few years going to be like, what are the next 10, 20 years going to be like, and which model ultimately, in terms of these two different experiments in human governance, which model is really ultimately going to be successful, this totalitarian, authoritarian model, or this open democratic model that we have in India and the United States. Of course, we can't answer that fully here, but hopefully in the years to come, we'll be able to engage further in these discussions. So thank you so much, Dr. Xavier. First and foremost, I want to thank you. I know it's very late in New Delhi, so thank you so much for this amazing, insightful lecture and the incredibly clear, concise, and well thought out answers to some very difficult questions. I also want to thank everyone who joined us from all across the world. We had participants from India, Kyrgyzstan, the United States, Nepal, and really just kind of reflecting the multiplicity of backgrounds and influences here. And so thank you to all the participants. I want to also thank all our panelists. So Colonel Dr. Bala, thank you so much for your insightful question. And Krishna Vavilala as well, thank you so much for not only being the founder and guiding force of FIS, but also for reaching out to Dr. Xavier and for really being the instrumental force in helping us put this lecture together. I'd be remiss without thanking our amazing technical team, Krishna Harshit Marapali, Chandra Vavilala, and Harsha Devolapalli, who was our on-the-grounds person in New Delhi and a good contact for Dr. Xavier in New Delhi. And finally, thank you to everyone who's here. I mean, this has been our first attempt to do a Zoom webinar sort of lecture, and I think we couldn't have made it possible without all the attendees, all the panelists, and of course without Dr. Xavier's amazing help. And lastly, I want to thank our supporting organizations, India Culture Center, Humanities Texas, and the Indian Wire, all of which really provided a lot of institutional support here. So thank you everyone for attending. We'll try to answer all these questions via email. And if anyone has additional questions, please email us at info@foundationforindiastudies.com, and we'll do our best to try to get these questions answered in a concise and timely manner. Thank you, everyone. And thank you again, Dr. Xavier, for your amazing presentation.
Thank you, Nish, and to the whole foundation. Keep up the great work and keep being a bridge between Texas, but the United States and India. Thank you.
Will do. Thank you, everyone.